Hello and welcome to another edition of RHOX Garage. I'm your host Kevin. On this episode, we're going to show you how to install a 6-inch BMF lift kit, part number LIFT-506, on this 2011 Club Car DS. Now before we get started, let's take a look at what's included with your lift kit, as well as all the tools necessary to perform the installation. Now when you open the box for your lift kit, you'll receive the front suspension component, followed by a driver and passenger side A-arm. You'll also receive 2 rear lift blocks, 2 shock mounting plates, 2 centering plates, and all necessary mounting hardware, as well as instructions. Now let's take a look at the tools necessary to perform the installation. Now in order to perform our installation today, we're going to be using the following tools. First we have a 10mm socket, 14mm socket, 17mm, 18mm, 19mm, and 21mm. Also we'll be using a 1/2 inch, 3/4, and 15/16 socket. We'll also use a ratchet, 10mm, 13mm, 14mm, and 17mm wrenches, a flathead screwdriver, Phillips head screwdriver, a tie rod separator, ball peen hammer, rubber mallet, some safety glasses, some smaller drill bits for drilling pilot holes, a 15/32 drill bit with an electric drill, and a cordless impact. Now that we've shown you all of the tools that we'll be using for our installation, let's begin installing our lift kit. Now this first step is only going to be required if you have a 2010 or newer Club Car DS. If you have a 2009 or older, you can go ahead and skip this step. Now we need to modify our front suspension by enlarging the 3 holes that are on our spindles. Now you'll have 2 holes on one spindle and 1 hole in the other where the tie rod ends will install. Now we need to do this because in the 2010 model year they made a change to the spindle, so as the suspension sits now, you wouldn't be able to install your tie rod ends to our spindles. Now we recommend that you do this before installing the suspension component, as it's a lot easier to access these holes off the cart. Now you're going to need a 15/32 drill bit, however you're going to want to start smaller and work your way up to that, but make sure to go no larger as your tie rod end could slip through the hole, and at that point there's nothing you can do, you can't go back. I also recommend using an electric drill versus cordless, because with a cordless drill you're going to have a lot of strain on the battery trying to drill through these holes. Also, place your suspension component on a sturdy foundation like a toolbox, table, or on the floor while drilling your holes, and be sure to wear safety glasses when drilling so that no metal fragments get into your eyes. Now that you've finished drilling out your 3 holes on your front suspension, before getting started on the actual installation, there's a couple of safety measures that you want to take first. Number 1, make sure your key is in the off position. Number 2, we want to make sure that we have our rear wheels chocked while working on the front end so the cart doesn't roll. And number 3, if you're working on an electric cart, make sure that your tow run switch is in the tow position. Now we've already gone ahead and taken these safety measures, so we're ready to move on to the first step, which is to jack the cart up and place it on jack stands. Once you have your cart safely supported on jack stands, the next thing we want to do is to remove and discard the factory wheels and tires. Now the next thing we're going to do is to remove the factory front bumper by removing the 2 bolts that secure it in place. Once we remove the hardware in the bumper, we're going to want to retain both parts, as we will be reinstalling them later on in the process. Once the front bumper has been removed, our next step is to remove the front hubs. Now in order to do this, we need to remove the dust caps, followed by the nuts securing the hub to the spindle. Now we need to retain the dust cap as well as the hub, however we can discard the nut that secured it to the spindle, as there are new nuts provided with our new front suspension. Now we want to move over to the other side and repeat the process to remove our other hub. Now at this time, we need to remove our 3 tie rod locations where they're attached to the spindle. Now you're going to have one mounting point on the driver's side and two on your passenger side. Once you remove the hardware, you're going to want to retain it as it will be reused later in the installation process. Now we're ready to remove the hardware that secures the shocks to the A-arms. Once the hardware has been removed, we can discard the hardware and push the shocks up out of the way. The next thing we're going to do is to remove the hardware that secures the lower portion of the A-arm to the spindle. Once the hardware has been removed, we can discard it as it will not be reused. And now you want to move over to the other side and repeat this process. Now we're ready to remove the hardware that secures the upper portion of the A-arms to the frame. Now once you remove the hardware, you're going to want to retain it as well as the two A-plate straps that are located there as well. You can discard the A-arms as they will not be reused. However, we're not going to be able to show you this portion of the installation as it's very difficult to access the area, but these bolts are going to be located directly behind this lower portion of the front cowl. Once the A-arms have been removed, our next step is to remove the 4 bolts that are holding up the entire front suspension. Once the hardware has been removed, you can discard the hardware as well as the entire front suspension assembly as they will not be reused. Now it's recommended that you have a second set of hands assist you with this process. However, if you don't have anybody available, you could also use a jack to place under the center of the suspension to help with the weight while you remove the bolts. Now before we discard our front suspension assembly, we need to separate our spring mount plate from the rest of the suspension. Now you can leave this portion on the cart and just drop the entire front suspension. However, we went ahead and left it attached so that we can show you this process a little bit closer up. Now you're going to want to retain the 4 long bolts that we removed to drop the entire suspension, as they'll be reused to reinstall the spring mount plate back onto the cart. Now that we have our spring mount plate separated from the rest of the suspension, we're going to set it off to the side for reinstallation. Now we can discard our front suspension assembly as well as the hardware that we just removed. Now this time we're going to go ahead and reinstall the spring mount plate using the original hardware that we removed earlier in the process. Now again, remember that you don't have to remove this plate when removing your front suspension assembly. We did so more for visual purposes rather than necessity. Now since we do have it down, we want to point out that the 4 holes that are in the center will be where your new front suspension assembly will line up with once this has been reinstalled. Now we're ready to install our new front suspension system. In order to ensure that your front suspension will line up correctly, you want to make sure that the RHOX plate is facing towards the front of the cart. Once you've done this, you want to raise the suspension in place and secure it using the 10x50 bolts with the 4 flat washers and 4 nylock nuts. Now we also recommend that you have some assistance when raising the front suspension in place, as it is a little bit heavy. However, if you are working solo, you can use a jack to help support the weight while you line up your mounting holes. Now that we have our suspension mounted, our next step is to install our new A-arms. Now we're going to do this by utilizing the factory A-plate straps as well as the factory mounting hardware. Now you want to be sure that when installing the A-plate strap, you mount it in between the bushing of the A-arm and the metal of the frame. Once you do that, you're going to loosely install the hardware at this time. Once you have your first A-arm installed, you want to move over to the other side of the cart and attach your other A-arm in the same fashion. Now for our next step, we're going to go ahead and attach our A-arm to our spindle. We're going to do so using the included 8x25mm bolts with flat washers and nylock nuts. Now you'll notice that on your A-arm, you have 5 slotted adjustments for your camber. We recommend starting with the second outermost position, and then you can adjust it from there once you put your wheels and tires on and get your car on the ground. Once you have one side attached, you want to move over to the other side of the cart and repeat these steps. Now at this time, we're ready to attach our shocks to our A-arms. Now to complete this step, we're going to utilize the included 8x50mm bolts with flat washers and nylock nuts. Now we're going to leave the hardware loose at this time, and once we complete this step, we're going to go back through and tighten all of the hardware that we've just installed to attach our A-arms to the cart. Now that we have our second shock attached, we're going to go back through and tighten all of the hardware that was used to mount our A-arms to the cart. Next, we want to install our tie rod ends into the 3 mounting points on our spindles. We're going to do so utilizing the factory hardware that we removed earlier in the process. Once you have the 3 tie rod ends installed, you want to go ahead and tighten your hardware. Now if you haven't done so already, the next thing we're going to do is to remove the newly supplied nut and washer from our spindle so that we can reinstall our factory hub. Once you have the hub installed and the hardware tight, you can then reinstall the factory dust cap. Once you have one hub installed, you want to move over to the other side of the cart and repeat these steps. And once you have your hubs installed, the next thing you need to do is grab a grease gun so that you can properly grease your spindles. After you've greased your spindles, be sure to wipe away any excess grease from the grease fittings. Once you've done that, you're ready to install your new wheels and tires. Once you have your wheels and tires installed, you want to place the jack under the front of the cart and raise it up high enough so that you can safely remove your jack stands. Once you've done that, you can lower the cart back onto the ground, and at this time we're not going to worry about any camber or toe adjustment until after the rear lift kit is complete. Now before beginning the installation of the rear lift kit, you want to be sure to chock the front wheels to prevent them from moving while the cart is jacked up in the air. Now the first thing we need to do is to jack up the rear of the cart so that we can safely place it on jack stands. Now, unlike the front, we don't want to completely remove the jack as we're going to need it to support the axle during the installation. Now our next step is to remove our factory wheels and tires. Once they've been removed, we can discard the wheels and tires as they will not be getting reused. Now it's important when working on the rear that you only do one side at a time, since the leaf spring is the only thing that's holding the axle in place. You may find it necessary to loosen the bolts on the U-bolt on the opposite side, but be sure not to completely remove them. Now the first thing we're going to do is to remove the hardware that's securing our shock to its mounting location. Once removed, we're going to push the shock out of the way and retain the mounting hardware. After that, we're going to remove the two bolts securing the U-bolt over the axle, and we can go ahead and discard that hardware once removed. Now, next thing we need to do is to remove the clip that's holding the brake cable in place. Once this clip has been removed, it'll provide more slack on the brake cable and allow us to work on the rear end much easier. Once you remove the clip, you can go ahead and discard it as it will not be reinstalled. At this time, we want to remove the rear shackle bolt as well as the front pivot bolt, and this will allow us to remove our rear leaf spring. And once we've done this, we want to hang on to the hardware as well as the leaf spring as they will be reused in the coming steps. Now once you have the leaf spring removed, you should be able to lower your jack just a little bit. Again, don't completely remove it. You want to keep it underneath the axle to keep it supported, but it'll give you some flex in your axle. This way, you can install the rear lift block. You want to make sure that the block has the slope facing towards the front of the cart when you place it in the cradle. And once you have your lift block installed, you're going to install the leaf spring on top of the axle while aligning the pin on the leaf spring with the hole on top of your lift block. You're then going to reinstall the factory hardware through the rear shackle and the front pivot. Now at this time you want to leave the hardware loose in our leaf spring, and don't worry if your pin on the leaf spring is not lining up with the centering hole on the lift block. We'll be able to get everything aligned as we go throughout the process. Now this time we're going to install our shock mounting plate on top of the leaf spring by aligning the hole on our shock mounting plate with the centering pin on our leaf spring. Once we have it in place, we're going to secure it using the hardware provided. Now the hardware is going to pass through the new shock mounting plate, over the axle, and through the original shock mounting plate underneath. Next, we're going to take the small nut and bolt that's included with our hardware kit and install it through the hole in our centering plate. Now once we have that installed, we're going to take the centering plate. The nut is going to go on the top side, so it should go into the hole that's on the bottom of the axle, and the nut will be going through the centering point on the original shock mounting plate. Then once you have the centering plate installed, the next thing you want to do is attach the shock to the new shock mounting plate. Now you want to leave all of the hardware loose at this time, as it will make it easier to work on the other side of the cart once we get to it. Now once you have the shock installed, we're ready to move over to the other side of the cart and repeat these steps for the opposite side's lift kit installation. When removing the bolts to get your leaf spring out, you may find one of the bolts may be seized inside of the sleeve that's inside of the bushing. If this is the case, you'll have to cut the bolt out in order to remove it. Now once you've done this, you'll have to replace either the bushings or the leaf spring itself. which is what we've had to do here. We've had to grab a new leaf spring because of what we had to do to get the old one out. Now once you have both sides completely installed, you want to go back through and tighten all of the hardware. Now while tightening your hardware, it's important that you make sure that all of your centering pins align with the mounting holes. Once you've tightened all of your hardware, I recommend going back and double checking that all hardware is actually tight and that you didn't miss anything in the process. Once you've done that, we're ready to install our new wheels and tires. Once you have your new wheels and tires installed, you want to go ahead and jack the rear of the cart up so that you can safely remove your jack stands. After that, we'll go ahead and lower the cart back down onto the ground, and once the cart's on the ground, we're going to prepare to make any adjustments for our tow and camber. Now that we have the cart back on the ground, we're ready to take a look at the tow and camber. Now as far as the camber goes, you want to have a bit of a positive camber, and if you don't have this, you'll need to jack the cart back up, loosen the 3 bolts that attach the A-arm to the spindle, and then you'll reposition them in one of the other 5 mounting holes for the camber. Once you do that and you tighten the bolts back up, you'll place the cart on the ground, take a look at your camber. If you have a good positive camber, you're all set. If not, jack it up and repeat that process. Now as far as the tow is concerned, you want to measure from the inside of tire to tire, and the front of the cart should have about 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch shorter distance between it from the rear. If you don't have this, you want to loosen the jam nut on the passenger and driver side of the vehicle and either lengthen or shorten your tie rod until you have the proper measurement. So you'll have to go back and measure each time until you have that 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch. Once you have the proper measurement, then you'll go back and tighten up your jam nuts. Now at this point, we have our toe adjusted to the 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch measurement that we talked about before. So now we're going to go ahead and tighten up our jam nuts. Now as far as the camber goes, our camber was already set positive when the cart came down, so we didn't have to make any adjustments there. Once you have your jam nuts tightened up, you want to go ahead and reinstall the front bumper using the factory hardware. Now that you have your front bumper reinstalled, we recommend going back through and double checking that all of your hardware has been properly tightened. Once you've done that, that'll complete the installation of our lift kit, part number LIFT-506, on this 2011 Club Car DS. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.